Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. My next guest is a Sydney-based author who has a number of both fiction and non-fiction titles to her credit. She has a demanding day job as a non-fiction publisher with one of Australia's largest publishing houses, but still finds the time to write about her passion for country music. Her second novel, The Shelly Bay Ladies Swimming Circle, has just been released by Hachette, and what an uplifting tale of friendship, love and belonging it is. I'm delighted to welcome Sophie Green to the podcast today. Hi, Sophie.
Hi, Claudine. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
That's good.
I wanted to say congratulations on the release of yet another fabulous book baby into the world.
Thank you.
As a publisher, you would have been part of many authors' journeys to publication, watching books morph through the various drafts into the form when it finally gets published and you see it out there in the wild. So I wanted to know, does it feel much different when the book is yours?
It does, in that I actually think I'm a little more distant from it because my job as a writer is done so many months in the past. When I'm a publisher, I'm with it right up until publication and then still thinking about it, making sure marketing materials are correct, talking to publicity, that sort of thing. But as the author, it's like it goes to the printer and then there's this gap. And then it's really out in the world beyond me, whereas from the publishing side of things, still very interested in where it is and talking to the authors about which retailers have it and all that sort of thing. So It does feel different, and possibly good different. I don't know. My personal jury is still out on whether it's I prefer the author experience or the publisher experience. Maybe I like them both equally.
Fair enough. Now, I have had the absolute honour and privilege of being able to have read your book. But for listeners out there who haven't, can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. It's the story of four quite different women, Teresa, Marie, Elaine and Leanne, who don't know each other at the start of the story, and they live in a fictional place called Shelly Bay, which is based on a real place, and anyone who knows that real place will recognise it when they read it. But Teresa starts the story and she begins swimming in the ocean to get fit. She thinks it's time she got fit, and along the way she encounters Marie, who's been swimming all of her life and she's in her 60s, and then Elaine and Leanne join in to swim with them. And the story is not about swimming per se, but it is about how having that common activity and that common challenging activity actually can bond them, I think, in a faster way than you might be bonded by something that's perhaps less challenging. And I love to write about the natural world. And in the previous book, Fairvale Ladies Book Club, I wrote about the Northern Territory. And in this case, I wrote about the ocean, and I grew up in the salt water, basically. So it felt a bit like writing home that's probably a naff thing to say, but that's what it feels like to me.
Not at all. And I guess that leads me very nicely to my next question. Where did you get your inspiration to write this story?
So I'm a lifelong saltwater swimmer, and I learnt to swim at the Harbour Beach, which is still my local beach. I haven't lived there, which is Balmoral in Sydney. I haven't lived there all of my life, but did learn to swim there in the baths as a very small person and swim there now. Not through winter because it can get quite cold, but and the air temperature is cold. But Balmoral doesn't have waves, but we do swim. Those of us who swim, that there's like at least a 200-metre stretch that most people who swim there will swim. And there are sharks out there, we know that, and there will be blue bottles at times, and I always check the tide charts and the pollution index, all those sorts of things. And so I think being a swimmer in the salt, you do become engaged in the natural world and an awareness of the natural world and how it changes a lot too. But ocean swimming, I've done a lot of as a body surfer. My father is a fantastic body surfer, and his favourite trick, at least I think is his favourite trick, is he'll catch every single wave regardless of whether it's going to dump or not. And if it's a dumper and he realizes that he'll rotate himself 180 degrees so he's facing up, and then he'll just move through the back of the wave to get out of it, which has to be seen to be believed, and I can never quite work out how he pulls it off. But he taught me to body surf and taught me how to read the water, and I love surf beaches. And I think in thinking about where to put this story, the surf beach made sense, because for new swimmers, that idea of getting out past the breaking waves and really grappling with the elements happens a lot more in an ocean beach than a harbour beach.
I was going to say to you that every day whilst driving my kids to school, I drive past the beach, and I often see those early morning ocean swimmers stroking across the water, and have always admired their dedication. And your book offered me a glimpse into the reasons why they might be so dedicated. You know, the healing powers of the ocean, the sense of being a very small part of something so vast. And you captured those feelings so well that it made me wonder whether you were an ocean swimmer. And obviously you are, and that's the reason why you've done that. It was such a real experience reading that.
Well, thank you. And I'm also, when I swim down at my local beach, for years I've noticed people talking to each other on the beach, will chat in the water. I don't see people swimming in groups, but if there's a chance for a connection between swimmers, it tends to happen. So at the end of swimming a lap of the beach, for example, you might pause, and invariably someone will say to me, "Oh, you wouldn't be dead for quids," or they'll say, "Yeah, isn't this amazing? What a beautiful day. Aren't we lucky?" And so I often think that people who do engage themselves in the water that way and in that early morning activity, we are united by a purpose, but there's also that real acknowledgement that this is a privilege. And I think maybe being in the water makes us more aware that it is. I don't know, but I have noticed that amongst swimmers there is that feeling, a collegiate feeling, and not a huge amount of competition going on, at least where I swim.
Now, one of the things I loved most about the book, that sense of place that you've captured so beautifully. The story is as much about Shelly Bay as it is about the 4 women who swim there. Your descriptions of the bay in the pre-dawn light, or even as the sun began to rise, honestly made me want to take up ocean swimming. Problem is, I'm definitely afraid of sharks.
Understandably so.
In all respects, it's an ode to Australian coastal living. Was it always your intention to pay homage to place in this way?
Yes, I think for me, place is always probably the first element of the story. Actually, not probably. With Fairvale, it certainly was. I had the idea for that book sitting on a bus riding between Catherine and Darwin and looking out the window at the landscape. Yeah. And I think for me, getting the place in mind for Shelly Bay, knowing what I was looking at, sparked the rest of it. I don't know that I could have come up with the characters unless I could see them somewhere. And then it's just a question of drawing on my memories of particular places and trying to describe what I see, trying to describe that light, describe the bush, describe the sky, what the beach looks like and its surrounds. And that's part of the fun, and it's also part of the challenge, because it is hard to depict it accurately without going into too much detail and making it so laboured that actually no one can relate to it.
In asking you that question, I was actually thinking about your first novel, the inaugural meeting of the Fairvale Ladies Book Club. And as you've said, you know, that was set in a vastly different place, being up in the Northern Territory, but obviously no less Australian than Shelly Bay. You've said that's not an accident, that's in fact by design. So I wanted to ask you, was there any one book or writer in particular that has most inspired you to be this kind of writer?
I don't think any one in particular, but as a child, the writer who made me most connect to place was Ruth Park in the book Playing Beatty Bow. Yeah. And I think that's because my imagination really fired at the idea of this story taking place in Harrington Street in the Rocks, which I'm a lifelong Sydney-sider. And as a kid, I could picture that. I could go to that street and maybe Beatty Bow might be there. And these days I work right near there, and part of me will still look for her there. Yeah. And so I think that idea, that connection to place was certainly fired by that particular novel. But also, if I go even further back, as a very small child, my favourite picture books included The Rainbow Serpent and The Devil Dingo Dogs by Dick Ruffsey, and that they were Dreamtime stories with artwork to match, which really beautifully depicted the red dirt of the top end and the trees and the sunsets of that part of the world. And so perhaps it started even then.
You've mentioned that you are an ocean swimmer, and I've read that you like to exercise first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Between work, writing, and your other interests, frankly, I don't know how you fit it in. But like Marie, Teresa, Leanne, and Elaine, I think there's untold benefits to giving yourself that time of reconnecting with your body, to be alone with your thoughts, free of the other demands that often take up space in our heads. Your book suggests this is especially important for women. Do you think this is true?
I do, because women do seem to get loaded up with a whole lot of responsibilities, and not just physical responsibilities, but emotional responsibilities for other people. And we can argue/discuss whether that's something we take on willingly, or that's something that we're expected to take on and that we expect each other to take on. But I do think that the emotional responsibilities I see women taking on can be as physically draining and as draining of time as the physical responsibility. So by which I mean household living, really, running a household. And I often use that term, running a household, rather than saying, someone doesn't work, or some things that come up. It's like, no, running a household is a huge amount of work. And if you add multiple people into that household, it multiplies. It's not like it's suddenly there's some kind of you're making the dinner for 4 is less effort than making it for 2 or something. No, it multiplies by the number of people who are there. So I think just getting that space to feel like there's something you can do that is taking care of yourself. Sometimes we all fall into the trap of thinking that we have to serve everyone else, and that's the way to be a good woman or be a good human, is to be in service to everyone else. But we actually can't do those responsibilities adequately if we're not taking care of ourselves, whether that is by carving out half an hour to swim or half an hour to sit on a rock and look at the sunrise. I don't think either of those is more important or more significant than the other. But yeah, I think for women, particularly in this very crowded world, we have so much visual information coming in. We have so many TV programs we're meant to watch and things we're meant to read. And it's really easy for your mind or your brain to just become this maelstrom of things that have to be done. And at a certain point, you need to cut that off, even if it's, as I said, for half an hour, even if it's for 10 minutes. I think you can do a lot of good in very small chunks of time.
Now, your characters were so relatable. Each of them is hiding pain, which the ocean and the friendships they form with one another help to heal. In fact, I believe if not for the friendships they shared, their lives could have turned out very differently. It made me reflect on some of the amazing groups of women that I have in my life, and how different or even less vibrant my life would be without them. I mean, family and work are important parts of our lives, and as mothers, we live for our kids and we put our needs or their needs ahead of our own. But it's friendships that bring colour to our world. Do you think women need friends more than men do?
No, I don't think they need them more than. I think men need friends equally as much. It's just that women are perhaps better at, well, actually not better, but we maybe tend to treat friendships more as a long-term relationship than a transactional relationship. But having said that, my brother is excellent at maintaining long-term friendships, but I do see him as being unusual amongst the men I know. But he puts a lot of work into it, and he's possibly, as I have watched our mother do that in particular, she's maintained friendships over decades and great distances. And he's doing the same thing. His best friend lives in the United States and has done for years. So I see in him that need is just as great, and that he understands that. But I'm not sure if other men are given the opportunity to see that in action to the same extent. I couldn't really say.
Apart from, place being a really important part of this story, you've set it in the 1980s, and I wondered what made you decide to set it in that era.
It was really just to flow it on from Fairvale, which started in 1978, and then I had this idea of, I'd come out that ended in the middle of 1981, and I sort of thought, yeah, I think I'm still in that era in my head. And I started Fairvale in 78 because the Thornbirds came out in 77, and I wanted that to be the first book the Fairvale ladies read. And I thought, well, how long will it take women in the Northern Territory to get their hands on the Thornbirds, basically? Yeah. And I thought, middle of 1978 was about right. So So in this one, I was still in that era, and then I was thinking, the film The Man from Snowy River was a big deal. At the time that came out, Tom Burlinson was a real heartthrob, and I thought, Teresa was the first character who came to me, and I was thinking, if I were Teresa at that age, at that time, Tom Burlinson would be a bit cute. So that's really what happened. And I just thought, all right, I'll keep on flowing in that time period and just see what happens. If it hadn't worked, if I'd started to write the story and I felt it was contemporary, I would have changed it. But to me, it all flowed on from Fairvale.
You deal with some fairly serious themes in this book, as we were talking about just before we started recording, but you've done it with such a deft touch, things like rape and a resulting unwanted pregnancy, fractured families, broken marriages, alcoholism, disease, aging and loneliness, just to name some of them. So many themes that readers from all walks of life can relate to. And I know that it makes the book sound a little bit depressing, but it's not at all. I just want to say that very clearly. It's not. It's ultimately a very heartwarming and uplifting story that makes you want to celebrate the strong women in your life. So I wanted to know, in your writing process, how do you stop yourself from delving too deeply into such serious themes?
I think I let the characters tell me, which always sounds like such a woo-woo thing to say, but it's true in that I create them, but then they do take on a life of their own. And so these things that are in their lives come to me as I'm writing them, and sometimes I'll have a little internal dialogue with them in a way, and just see where it's not that they really talk back to me, but it's just that process of working out where this thing fits into their story. And I think if it needed to be more dramatic than it was, then that would have come through. But I'm also really aware that so many of us do handle really big things in everyday life, and we keep on going. And I think the term I mentioned to you was this just everyday bravery of so many people who are managing. You might have children with something going on. You might have an aging parent who needs help. There are things at work. There are all sorts of things that people manage on multiple levels every day. And to go off with just one of those things and make it feel more dramatic, it is dramatic, but to give it, I suppose, more emphasis than other things can upset the balance of how your whole life works. And I think for those characters, they are dealing with a lot, but I don't think they're dealing with any more than I see a lot of people deal with every single day.
Now, I'll tell you what made my mouth water whilst reading this book, and that was your description of Marie's Anzac cookies. And I thought there was going to be like a recipe for them in the back of the book, but alas, there wasn't. In my experience, when writers include description of baked goods in their stories, it usually means they're avid bakers themselves, though not always. So I wanted to ask you, do you enjoy baking?
I do bake. I don't do it very often because actually I don't tend to eat what I bake. I'm actually not I love making cakes because I get really smug about the fact that it's worked, but I don't then eat them. They tend to sit there and I go, what am I going to do with that? I might have a slice just to check that it worked. And then I think, I'm not going to eat that. But the Anzac biscuits came to me because there was a wonderful woman I knew from childhood who died a couple of years ago, and not long before she died, she was telling me about the Anzac biscuits she'd made, and the sugar was the difference, and so that's the detail that found its way into Shelly Bay.
Indeed, fantastic. As I mentioned in my introduction, you work as a publisher in the non-fiction space, and I wanted to know, has that helped or hindered your journey as a writer, do you think?
I think neither, to a great extent. I was I'm just trying to think, actually, because sometimes there are tears, but as a writer, not as a publisher. But I went in, the Fairvale was commissioned without most people knowing it was me, so when it went through the acquisitions process, there was a different name on it, and only the publisher and the publishing director knew it was me. And that's because I wanted my colleagues to feel that they could say no to it.
Yeah.
And I didn't want them to think, we better do this, because no one wants a publishing company that's not keen on what they're doing.
Yeah.
So as a writer, I think it's probably more that I have an editorial background that makes the difference. Makes being a writer slightly harder. And I think it's possibly harder for the people who edit me as well, because I will get really annoyed with myself that I should have known. I always think I should have known how to do that. That's just ridiculous. And so I'll get quite quite annoyed and sometimes upset with myself. But look, I think I love being a publisher. It is so satisfying to find great books, work with fantastic authors, and see that book come out. Writing is a much more emotional process and always ego challenging. I'd like to say that I think writers need to have a bit of ego. You have to claim the role as a storyteller, because otherwise your readers, I think your readers need to be able to trust that you're doing that. They need to be able to relax and know that you've taken charge of that. But of course, what that means is that at every step of the editorial process, you're butting up against that ego and that sense, as I said, of thinking, oh, I should have known how to do that, and I should be better than this. But always, ultimately, I think with writing and with publishing, we have to serve the story, and that belief tends to get me through any sticky moments.
I take heart from some of the things that you've said there, because as a publisher, you're saying you should have known better.
Oh yes, like always. But that's but I actually ultimately look back and think I'm glad I think that, as opposed to I'm perfect and don't change anything.
Absolutely,
So yeah.
Now, Sophie Green is a pen name, and I wondered if there was a reason for that.
Oh, it's a practical thing. It was more, and it's practical within the publishing company I work with, just to be able to divide the business of Sophie Green from my real name, and I think also I do have one thing written under my real name, and I have used pen names in the past for other things, and so I also think I was just in the habit of it, and I quite like it because it keeps things discreet. I can say that's a Sophie Green project or that's something else. Yeah. So yeah, it's just practical.
In the same way you celebrate the Australian landscape in your novels, you celebrate Australian music through your blog, Jolene. Can you tell me a little bit about this and why it's so important to you?
Oh, look, I could go on for years about country music. I did not like country music when I joined a country music band several years ago now. I have a dear friend who's also now my guitar teacher, and she has been in music for years. She was forming a new covers band. She needed a backup singer and a percussionist, and I tried out, was accepted, and then realised I didn't like country music. But we went to play at the Tamworth Country Music Festival, and from memory this was 2005 we played Tamworth, and I completely fell in love with absolutely everything I experienced there. It was one of the most extraordinary things to be there and see and hear music going on from early in the morning till very late at night, to see everyone so relaxed and happy, because everyone who loves country music knows it's daggy. No one's trying to be cool in Tamworth. So there's just these exchanges between punters, just little chit chats. The musicians were all friendly to each other, and the standard was amazing. And so I've been back to Tamworth several times. I didn't start writing about country music to any great extent until 2011, and the reason for that is actually nothing to do with the music so much as I am also a yoga teacher, and I had been teaching for many years by that stage, and I got very, very sick in July 2011 and could not teach anymore. For months and months actually, and I couldn't do anything. Actually, I was housebound for several months, and I felt I needed a creative outlet. Teaching had been my creative outlet because I would make up a new sequence every week and workshop that like you'd workshop a story, because I think of a class sequence as being like telling a story for that week. And I didn't have that, and I really felt for the first time a loss of creative work. And so I'd started the blog a couple of years before but done not much at all with it. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I can pick that up. And I researched some publicists who were working in country music and contacted them and just said, can I do any interviews, or can I review anything? And a couple of them were kind enough to send some interviews and albums my way. And so I started writing about it, not very regularly. But then once I'd done a few things, there just aren't that many people writing about Australian country in particular. And so publicists started to contact me, and now it is the case that I don't go looking for anything really. I'm contacted every day by publicists with music or interview requests, and always for me I'm so impressed by our country music artists, even after all these years of writing about it and going to Tamworth, or perhaps especially after all these years, seeing the wealth of talent that's out there, the skill that they bring to their work, their dedication to audience, their the collaborations that go on and that are inspired by Tamworth. And also I realise that this has all informed what I do as a novelist. The writing practice for the blog has been a way to actually write to someone. So that really trained me to write to an audience, because I'm aware there are people out there and I'm writing to them. And so that really focuses the attention and helps me determine what words I choose and what I write about. But also the nature of storytelling in Australian country music and those artists focus on the audience made me start to think about telling Australian stories. I'm very fond of saying that Tamworth is Australia's biggest storytelling festival. It is only for Australian artists, and it's apparently it's our biggest festival of any kind. And every January in that heat, in that inland heat in Tamworth, people turn up, often in polyester, which they shouldn't do in heat. And I look around and some think, oh, please, just cotton. You don't be so hot in your polyester. But they turn up and the open-mindedness of the audience to new stories. So the country music audience does skew older, and generally speaking, and it's not uncommon to see people in their 60s, 70s, 80s welcoming a new 18-year-old artist who might have a couple of songs. And these audience members are so keen to see what's new and what's out there, and that really makes me think about who readers are for certain types of stories. I think particularly working in the publishing industry, you can get set ideas about who's reading what and who's looking for what. But Tamworth always reminds me that we can never make judgments or assumptions about who we think the audience is, and that there are plenty of people out there looking for Australian stories. And so that's, I continue to write that blog because I know those artists want to share their stories, and I know there's an audience out there for them. And as I said, the level of talent and skill that goes on, and the incredible music that comes out of that industry every year, I would just love everyone to know about. So that's really fundamentally why I keep doing it.
That's so interesting to me, Sophie, because that's exactly how I feel about Australian authors. And that's the reason why I started this podcast. Was because, and I only deal with Australian stories, and that's because I really wanted to shine a spotlight on the wealth of talent that we have in this country and to celebrate Australian stories. So it's very interesting to me that you say that, and maybe we need a big festival like Tamworth, but for Australian stories in written form.
Well, I agree, and I get really irritated when I see like Blues Fest, for example. There was one year in particular I was super irritated because I've been at Tamworth, and Casey Chambers is one of the queens of Tamworth. She's not the only queen, there are several, but she's one of, and she's a headlining artist, and everyone who is at that festival knows who she is. Yeah. And then I was driving out of town and I saw a poster for Blues Fest, and there were British and UK artists top billing, second top billing, and then there was a chunk of much smaller type with Australian artists, and Casey was in the middle. And I just thought, something's wrong there, because those overseas artists, yes, I know we all think they're amazing, but why do we think they're so much better? I think it's just because to an extent we can tell ourselves that they're better, and partly that's related to our lingering cultural cringe. Yep. We think the things from overseas are better. Yep. But I have been to so many different types of musical acts over the years, and I think there are so many people in Tamworth who, it's sort of like that thing of there's more talent in performance in your little finger in Tamworth than you'd find in a whole hand's worth in another country. I think Australian storytelling festivals, whether it's the written word or the performed word, definitely are the go.
Yeah, I think there's something in that. I think we really need to take up the charge and, be pushing for, more Australian authors to be headline acts for literary festivals around the country, because I think it's not quite so at the moment?
No, it's like Blues Fest.
Exactly right. Well said. Now, given your experience in the publishing industry, I wanted to ask, what tips would you give to the many aspiring or emerging writers who listen to this podcast?
Well, the first thing I'd recommend is that you Google 4 Tendencies quiz. Now, this is something that has been put together by Gretchen Rubin, who's an American writer and whom I think is just wonderful. She has a podcast called Happier with Gretchen Rubin. And if you take her 4 Tendencies quiz and find out which tendency you are, that will really help, I think, more than anything else, help you work out how to organize your writing or how to develop your writing habit in a way that actually sticks, because the 4 tendencies are all about habit forming. And a lot of people will want to be an upholder. Now, I'm an upholder, and I'm glad I'm an upholder because we are the just do it tendency. So for me as a writer, that means I don't ever question my need to do it. I just do it. So I write my first drafts on public transport. I have 20 minutes start of the day and end of the day. I don't spend any of those minutes thinking about whether I should do it or not, or wishing I was looking out the window. I just do it. But if you're an obliger, which is the biggest tendency, you will need someone to hold you accountable for doing it in order to do it. And so I think a lot of people think, oh, I should just be able to do it. I don't understand why I can't motivate myself to do it. And Gretchen's framework really liberates obligers in particular from that kind of thinking, which can be really upsetting if you're thinking, oh, I should just be able to start that novel and I've been thinking about it for so long. If you know you're an obliger, Gretchen's whole line is basically get yourself an accountability partner, whether it's another writer or she says basically family members don't make good accountability partners. Get yourself an accountability partner, and that will really help. And then once you're in the habit, you've got that habit, and it'll be harder to break it. There are also questioners and rebels. Rebels basically will do whatever they want whenever they want. Questioners need reasons to do it. So I think taking that quiz and finding out what tendency you are, is the best thing. And then after that, what I tend to say to people is get out of your own way, because a lot of the time as a writer, you can really think yourself into the trough of, oh, am I good enough? Is that good enough? Is that sentence okay? I don't know about this. And it can be better to just write something out and do the best you can, and then let someone else tell you if it's any good, because you can waste a lot of time and energy getting in your own way before you even reach that point. And none of us can edit our own work. None of us is the best judge of our own work. So at a certain point, you will have to be brave and turn it over to someone else.
Fantastic advice. I really like that 4 Tendencies quiz. I think I might do that.
She actually has a book. There are 2 books. There's Better Than Before, which is a book about habit forming in general, and the 4 tendencies are mentioned in that. And then she wrote a book specifically about the 4 tendencies because she had so many questions about it, I think. And Better Than Before is great as well for anyone who wants to start any kind of habit or break a habit, because she looks at all sorts of crutches and reasons why people don't break habits, why they can't start doing something new. It's just really interesting, readable nonfiction.
Sophie, what's next? Are you working on another novel at the moment?
Oh, look, I have ideas. I'm always working on various projects. So I have all sorts of ideas, and I have some things that are half formed, not necessarily in this vein, in the vein of Shelly Bay, rather. Yes. But for the next Sophie Green project, I haven't quite decided. I think I've decided on a location, but then again, maybe I'll change my mind. And as I said, with these 2 novels, it was the location that really spurred it. So I'll know when I've chosen the right location, because the story will start flowing, and I think that's just happened in the past few days. And again, this is part of that the woo-woo mystical business of writing is. And getting out of one's own way to an extent is to trust those things when they come in. And once a character starts talking to me, I will pay attention and I will start making notes. And things will always change. The stories always change, but I don't ever question what's coming in. I just say, okay, let's go.
Now, Sophie, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how could they do that?
I am on Twitter at Sophie Green Auth, AUTH, and there is a Facebook page as well if you search on Sophie Green Author. And I do have a website, which is sophiegreenauthor.com, and there's a contact form on there.
That's brilliant. Sophie, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Pleasure was all mine. Now, listeners, a copy of this wonderful novel is up for grabs courtesy of Hachette Australia. If you want to be in the draw to win, head over to my Instagram or Facebook account and follow the prompts. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.